When the ones you love hurt you, God becomes your healing touch. Love and wounds are intertwined the deeper we love, the greater our vulnerability. To love at all is to risk being hurt, for love exposes the heart to both joy and sorrow. Hurt reveals the depth of attachment when those we love wound us. It is not merely pain we feel, but the echo of the love we have invested. The greater the pain, the greater the love that precedes it. God, as the ultimate comforter, human love is finite and frail, but God's love is infinite and steadfast. When human affection fails us, the divine love steps in to bind our wounds. Pain becomes a pathway to grace. Hurt can either harden the heart or open it to transformation. In our brokenness, we are often most receptive to God's healing presence. Forgiveness as a divine act, forgiving those who hurt us, is not natural, it is supernatural. In forgiving, we imitate God, who forgives us endlessly and unconditionally. Healing comes through trust, not denial. To heal, we must trust the divine touch, acknowledging our pain rather than suppressing it. God cannot heal wounds we refuse to reveal. Suffering refines our love just as fire refines gold, so suffering refines our love. It burns away selfishness, purifies our motives, and teaches us to love as God loves. God's love transcends human failure. The love of God does not falter when human love disappoints. In our darkest moments, his love remains the one constant. Brokenness as an invitation to the eternal. When human relationships fracture, we are reminded of their temporal nature. God uses such moments to draw us closer to eternal truths and his unchanging presence. Healing as a journey toward wholeness. The healing touch of God does not merely soothe, it restores. It leads us beyond survival to renewal, where wounds become scars of wisdom and compassion. To love at all is to open oneself to the profound and unpredictable tides of the human heart. Love is not a shield, but an open door, inviting both delight and devastation. It is no safe enterprise, for the more we give ourselves to another, the more we surrender the fragile treasures of our soul to their keeping. This is the paradox of love. It offers the sweetest joys, but does not exempt us from the sharpest sorrows. Indeed, love is a beautiful risk, but a risk nonetheless. It demands we set aside the armor of self-preservation, leaving ourselves vulnerable to wounds we would otherwise never know. The deeper the affection, the more vulnerable the heart becomes. The lover does not simply risk pain, they accept it as a likely companion to their joy. The wounds of love are not always inflicted maliciously. Often they are the unintended consequences of human frailty. We are imperfect beings, after all, and even the purest intentions are marred by the limits of our understanding. To be hurt by those we love is not always to be betrayed, but to witness the inevitable shortcomings of mortal affection. Yet, there is something astonishing in the resilience of a heart that loves. Though it may bleed from the wounds inflicted, it rarely ceases to love. This, perhaps, is the mystery of love, that even in its pain, it continues to affirm its object, to seek connection, to hope for redemption. It bears all things, believes all things, endures all things, even when it suffers most. One cannot help but marvel at how pain amplifies love's significance. Just as light is most visible in the shadow of darkness, so love often reveals its deepest truths in the midst of sorrow. The heart that loves and suffers does not lose its value. Rather, it is shaped, refined, and deepened by the experience. We often speak of love as a thing of beauty, but we forget that beauty itself is not without cost. A rose, for all its fragrance and splendor, bears thorns that can pierce the skin. Love, too, is adorned with thorn-sharp reminders that its beauty is inseparable from its capacity to wound. And yet, who would refuse the rose for fear of its thorns? The vulnerability inherent in love is not a weakness, but a testament to its strength. To love is to expose oneself to another's flaws, failings, and wounds, all while daring to believe that the connection forged is worth the cost. This is not the work of the timid, but of the brave, for it takes courage to love fully, knowing that pain is never far behind. When we are wounded by love, it is tempting to retreat, to seal off the heart from further harm. But in doing so, we risk far more than we imagine. A heart that refuses to love is not safe, it is merely lifeless. The choice to love, even at the cost of pain, is the choice to remain fully alive, to embrace the fullness of what it means to be human. If love and pain are inseparable, then so too are love and healing. For the wounds of love, while deeply felt, also carry within them the seeds of restoration. The heart that has loved and been hurt does not remain in ruin, it is tended to by a grace that understands its plight. In time, the scars left by love become the markers of a life lived richly and deeply. There is no greater testament to love's worth than its ability to endure even the wounds it inflicts. To love is to take up a great and holy endeavor, knowing full well that it may cost us dearly. And yet, in that cost we find not ruin but redemption. For the heart that has loved and suffered is a heart that has truly lived, a heart that reflects something of the eternal. The pain we feel when wounded by a loved one is never a solitary agony. It is tethered to the love that we have given, the trust we have placed, and the connection we have nurtured. Hurt in such moments is not a hollow thing, it is rich with meaning, an echo of something far deeper. It speaks to the investment of the heart, a reminder that we cared enough to be vulnerable, enough to be affected. This is the peculiar arithmetic of love. The greater the bond, the sharper the sting when it falters. A stranger's slight might trouble us for an hour, but the wound inflicted by a loved one lingers, not because we are weaker in such moments, but because the bond itself is stronger. Pain, then, is not the measure of failure, but of the depth to which the relationship matters. We cannot be wounded by what we do not cherish. The pain of betrayal, disappointment, or misunderstanding from a loved one is the shadow cast by the light of our attachment. If the love were shallow, the hurt would be fleeting. But when the heart has poured itself deeply, the pain becomes a mirror of the depth of that pouring. This truth is unsettling, but also strangely beautiful, for it reveals that pain is not an enemy of love, but its companion. To love deeply is to care about the outcome, to hope for reciprocation, to desire understanding. When these hopes are unmet, it is precisely because they are so meaningful to us that their absence is keenly felt. Such wounds remind us of our humanity, of the simple fact that love cannot exist without risk. To care for another is to place a part of ourselves in their hands. When that trust is mishandled, whether by neglect, intention, or the inevitable imperfections of human nature, it is no wonder that we ache. Yet this ache is evidence of our love's vitality, not its failure. It would be a mistake to see such pain as proof of love's folly. On the contrary, it is proof of its significance. A love that does not hurt when wounded is not love at all, but indifference cloaked in affection. To feel deeply, even in sorrow, is to affirm that the connection mattered, that it was real and worth having. But then becomes a kind of teacher. It invites us to reflect on what we have given and received, to see where love has been honored and where it has been stretched thin. It challenges us to discern whether the relationship can be mended or whether it must be released. But even in this discernment, it calls us to remember the depth of attachment that made the pain possible. There is, perhaps, a strange grace in this process. For as much as hurt exposes our wounds, it also reveals the capacity of the human heart to love with abandon. It shows us that we are creatures made for connection, for risk, for the kind of vulnerability that makes life rich and meaningful. To be hurt is to have dared to love. And that in itself is a testament to the beauty of the soul. In this light, hurt is not simply an end, but a beginning. It is a reminder of what we hold dear, a call to examine the bonds that shape us, and an opportunity to deepen our understanding of love's true nature. Pain does not diminish the love that preceded it, it honors it, marking it as something profound and irreplaceable. Even in our pain, we discover the echoes of something eternal. For to love and to hurt is to participate in the great mystery of existence, where joy and sorrow intertwine, and where every wound reminds us that we are bound, not by indifference, but by the infinite threads of love. When human love falters and leaves us aching, it is not the end of love itself, but an invitation to seek its ultimate source. We often anchor our hearts in earthly affections, hoping they will fulfill the depths of our longing, only to find that even the purest human love is marked by imperfection. It is in these moments of disappointment, when the fragility of human connection is laid bare, that the love of God reveals itself as the steadfast comfort we so desperately need. God's love is not like ours, bound by conditions, misunderstandings, or exhaustion. Where human love sometimes hesitates, falters, or retreats, the love of God remains unchanging and infinite. It does not ebb with time or waver with circumstance. It is a love that pursues us even in our unworthiness, a love that heals where human love has wounded, when those we trust fall short or abandon us. The ache we feel is a void that no earthly affection can fill. And yet, this void is not a place of despair, but of divine opportunity. For in the depths of our pain, God's love steps in not as a substitute for human affection, but as its ultimate fulfillment. Where human hands falter, his hands gently bind the wounds of the soul. This divine love is not distant or abstract. It is a presence that meets us precisely where we are most broken. God does not wait for us to be whole before offering his comfort. Instead, he meets us in the shattering, holding together what we cannot. His touch is not hurried nor dismissive. It is patient, tender, and deeply personal. Human love, for all its beauty, often fails because it is finite. It cannot bear the weight of infinite expectation, nor can it always understand the intricacies of our hearts. But God's love is infinite, knowing us fully and loving us completely. In his love there is no misunderstanding, no abandonment, no betrayal. It is a love that sees our flaws and embraces us still. The wounds inflicted by human affection can lead us to despair, but they can also lead us to God. Pain has a peculiar way of turning our gaze heavenward, reminding us that our ultimate comfort does not lie in the hands of others, but in the hands of the one who created us. It is in his love that we find the solace no human can provide. And yet God's comfort does not erase our pain as though it were nothing. Instead, he transforms it, weaving it into the tapestry of his greater purposes. The wounds we bear are not ignored but tended to with care, and through his love they become marks of redemption rather than mere scars of loss. To experience God's comfort is to be reminded that we are never truly alone. Even when human affection abandons us, he remains, whispering to us in the quiet moments of despair, "I am here." His love is a refuge for the weary, a fortress for the broken, and a wellspring of hope for those who feel forgotten. In God's love, there is no lack. What human love cannot sustain, his love completes. It does not diminish the value of human affection, but elevates it, showing us that all earthly love is but a shadow of the divine. When we rest in his infinite love, we are not merely comforted, we are transformed, made whole by the one whose love never fails. In this way, the failures of human affection become an invitation to something greater. They remind us that while the love of others may falter, the love of God remains eternal. And in that love we find a comfort so deep, so unwavering, that it carries us through every hurt, binding us to the one who is the very source of love itself. Pain, unwelcome though it may be, carries within it a strange and redemptive potential. It meets us in the rawness of our humanity, stripping away the illusions of invincibility and self-sufficiency that so often cloud our hearts. In its wake we are left exposed, vulnerable, and paradoxically open. It is here, in this place of brokenness, that grace finds its way in. Hurt has the power to harden the heart if we let it. It can drive us to bitterness, to self-protection, to a refusal to feel again. The wounded soul is tempted to build walls so high and thick that no further harm can penetrate, but neither can love. Yet even in this hardened state, pain whispers of another way. It invites us to choose not isolation but transformation, not bitterness but grace. Brokenness is fertile ground for grace to grow. When the heart is shattered, its fragments seem to cry out for healing, for restoration, for something greater than the sum of its parts. It is in this cry that we become most attuned to the presence of God, whose grace is sufficient even in our weakest moments. Pain empties us of our pride and leaves us yearning for the filling only he can provide. There is a strange alchemy in the way God uses our wounds. What we see as loss, he uses as opportunity. The broken heart, so fragile and bruised, becomes the very canvas on which he writes his story of redemption. Pain is not wasted in his hands, it is transformed into a pathway toward deeper intimacy with him. A journey marked not by despair, but by hope. Grace does not erase the pain, but redeems it. It does not ignore our suffering or pretend it never happened. Instead, it gathers up our tears and weaves them into something beautiful. It softens what has been hardened, heals what has been torn, and strengthens what has been weakened. In this way, pain becomes not the end of the story, but the beginning of something new. In our brokenness, we learn to see differently. What once seemed unbearable becomes a means of communion with the one who understands our suffering most intimately. Christ himself was no stranger to pain, and in our hurt we are drawn into the fellowship of his wounds. His grace meets us there, not in the absence of suffering, but in its very midst. Pain also teaches us to depend on God in ways we might never have considered in times of ease. When all else is stripped away, we find that his grace is not an abstraction, but a tangible reality. It sustains us when we feel we cannot take another step. It carries us when we are too weary to carry ourselves, and in that carrying we discover a strength that is not our own. The transformative power of pain lies not in the pain itself, but in the response it evokes. When we allow it to turn us toward God, it becomes a doorway to growth, to compassion, to a deeper understanding of love and grace. What once felt like a curse becomes a gift, not because the hurt was good, but because God is good and he redeems all things for those who seek him. To embrace grace in the midst of pain is to see the hand of God working even in the darkest hours. It is to trust that he is not absent in our suffering, but profoundly present, shaping us into something more like himself. The process is neither quick nor easy, but it is holy, and it leads us to a place of greater wholeness than we could have imagined. Pain, when surrendered to God, does not leave us unchanged. It shapes us, softens us, and draws us closer to the heart of grace. It reminds us that even in the deepest brokenness, we are never beyond the reach of his love. And in this, pain becomes not an end, but a pathway to transformation, to healing, and to the infinite grace of God. Forgiveness is not the instinctive response of the wounded heart. When we are hurt, the natural impulse is to retreat, to harbor resentment, to cling to the pain as a form of justice. Yet forgiveness calls us to something far beyond our nature. It is not a denial of the hurt, but a transformation of it, a divine act in which we participate in the very heart of God's love. To forgive is to set aside the scales of human reckoning and take up the boundless grace of God. Human justice demands retribution, a balancing of wrongs, but divine forgiveness transcends this calculus. It does not ignore the offense, but chooses to release it, to let go of the claim we hold against another. This is no mere moral effort, it is an act of grace that flows from God's own forgiveness of us. Forgiveness is not easy, for it costs us something. It requires the surrender of our right to bitterness, the relinquishment of our desire to see the offender suffer as we have suffered. This surrender feels unnatural, because it is supernatural. It is a reflection of God's own forgiveness, a mirror of the mercy he extends to us every day. We do not forgive because the other deserves it, we forgive because we have been forgiven. The human heart resists this truth, insisting that forgiveness must be earned. But God's forgiveness is never earned. It is given freely, lavishly, even to those who least deserve it. And in imitating this divine act, we step into the mystery of his grace, becoming vessels of his boundless love. Forgiveness does not minimize the hurt we have endured. It does not pretend that the wound was shallow or that the wrong was insignificant. Rather, it acknowledges the depth of the pain and chooses to respond with mercy instead of vengeance. In this, forgiveness becomes a profound act of faith, a trust that God's justice and healing are greater than our own. When we forgive, we are not condoning the wrong, but entrusting it to God. We release the burden of judgment, knowing that he alone sees the full truth of every situation. This release does not leave us powerless, it frees us from the chains of anger and bitterness that would otherwise bind us to the past. Forgiveness liberates not only the forgiven, but also the forgiver. The act of forgiving is itself a healing process. It softens the heart that might otherwise harden, bringing peace where there was once turmoil. In forgiving, we align ourselves with the redemptive work of God. who transforms wounds into sources of grace. It is not an instant cure for pain, but a step toward wholeness, a turning of the heart toward love. Forgiveness is a reflection of divine strength, not human weakness. It takes courage to forgive, for it requires us to confront the hurt rather than hide from it. It is an act of profound humility, acknowledging that we too are in need of forgiveness and grace. In this humility, we find the strength to extend to others what we ourselves have so freely received from God. The practice of forgiveness reshapes our hearts to resemble Christ's. In forgiving, we participate in his love, which bore the ultimate cost to offer forgiveness to all. It is a sacred imitation of his sacrifice, a reminder that his mercy knows no bounds, and that we are called to reflect that mercy in our own lives. In the end, forgiveness is not simply an act we perform, but a state of being into which God invites us. It is a way of living in harmony with his love, allowing his grace to flow through us to others. It is not natural, it is divine. And in forgiving, we draw closer to the one who forgives us endlessly and unconditionally, becoming living witnesses to the power of his grace. Healing begins with honesty. To acknowledge pain is to take the first step toward wholeness, for wounds left hidden cannot be tended. We may be tempted to suppress our hurt, to bury it beneath the surface of busy lives or stoic facades, but denial is no remedy. Pain unacknowledged festers in the shadows, while healing requires the light of truth and the courage to bring our brokenness before God. Trust is the bridge between our wounds and God's healing touch. It is not a passive acceptance, but an active surrender, a decision to open our hearts, even when vulnerability feels dangerous. To trust is to lay bare the parts of ourselves we would rather keep hidden, believing that God's hands are gentle enough to hold what is fragile and strong enough to restore what is broken. Denial may feel like self-protection, but it is, in truth, a barrier to grace. God does not force his healing upon us. He waits patiently for us to invite him into the places of our pain. When we pretend that all is well, we close the door to the very source of our restoration. Healing requires not a facade of strength, but the humility to admit our need. Pain is not a sign of weakness, it is a testament to our humanity. To hurt is to be alive, to have loved, to have risked, to have cared. God does not ask us to deny this, he invites us to trust him with it. In his presence, our pain is not dismissed, but held with tenderness and compassion. He sees the depths of our wounds and offers a love that reaches even deeper. True healing is not the absence of pain, but the redemption of it. It is not a matter of forgetting the hurt or pretending it never happened. It is the transformation of the wound into something that no longer defines us but refines us. God does not erase our scars, he imbues them with meaning, reminding us of his faithfulness and grace. To trust God with our pain is to believe that he is both willing and able to heal. It is to release the burden of trying to mend ourselves and to place our brokenness in his hands. This trust is not always easy. It requires us to relinquish control, to admit that we cannot fix what has been shattered. Yet it is in this surrender that we find freedom. Healing is a process, not an instant event, and trust is what sustains us through the journey. There will be days when the wounds still ache, when the path seems long and the progress slow. But even in these moments, God's faithfulness does not waver. His work is not hurried but perfect, and he walks with us every step of the way. Denial, on the other hand, keeps us trapped in a cycle of unresolved hurt. It may offer temporary relief, but it robs us of true healing. To trust God is to allow him into the hidden chambers of our hearts, where he can do the deep and lasting work that denial can never achieve. Trust is the antidote to the isolation that pain so often brings. God's healing is not distant or impersonal, it is intimate and deeply personal. He does not see us as projects to be fixed, but as beloved children to be restored. In trusting him with our wounds, we experience the fullness of his care, a care that does not minimize our suffering, but redeems it, turning ashes into beauty. Healing begins when we stop pretending and start trusting. God's love is not deterred by our brokenness, it is drawn to it. He stands ready to bind up every wound, but he will not force his way into the places we refuse to reveal. To heal, we must trust, and in that trust we discover the boundless compassion of the one who knows our pain and offers us his peace. Suffering is a crucible, an intense and refining fire that tests the metal of our love. It strips away pretense and lays bare the heart of what we hold dear. When we walk through pain, the selfish motives that so often entwine themselves with our love are exposed and burned away. What remains, if we allow it, is something purer, something closer to the selfless, sacrificial love of God. In the face of suffering, we come to see the limits of shallow affection. Love rooted in convenience or self-interest withers under the heat of trials. But the love that endures is one that learns to give without demanding in return, to persevere even when the cost feels unbearable. This is not a natural love, it is a love shaped by suffering and sustained by grace. Pain challenges us to love beyond ourselves. When we are hurting, the temptation is to turn inward, to focus on our own wounds and neglect the needs of others. Yet suffering offers an opportunity to rise above this impulse, to extend love even when it feels like there is nothing left to give. It is in these moments that our love becomes an echo of God's own, a love that gives without ceasing, even in the face of rejection or pain. Suffering also teaches us the value of humility in love. It reminds us that we are not the masters of our own hearts, that true love is not something we create, but something we are called to reflect. In our brokenness, we come to depend more fully on God, whose love is the wellspring from which all genuine affection flows. This dependence is not a weakness, but a strength, for it aligns our love with his perfect example. As fire refines gold by removing impurities, so suffering refines our capacity to love. It reveals the selfishness we so often disguise as care, the pride we mask as concern, the fear we mistake for devotion. These impurities cannot survive the refining fire. They are burned away to reveal a love that is truer, deeper, and more enduring. Through suffering, we come to understand the sacrificial nature of love. It is no longer about what we can gain, but about what we can give. This is the love of Christ, who endured the ultimate suffering not for his own sake, but for ours. In our pain, we are invited to partake in this divine love, to reflect it in our relationships with others. Suffering also deepens our empathy, allowing us to love with greater compassion. When we have walked through the fire ourselves, we are better able to comfort those who are in the midst of their own trials. Our wounds, rather than isolating us, become a bridge to others, a shared language of love that transcends words. The refining work of suffering is not quick, nor is it easy. It is a process that requires patience, trust, and a willingness to endure. But as we submit to this process, we find that our love is transformed. It becomes less about self-preservation and more about self-giving, less about fleeting emotions and more about steadfast commitment. In suffering, we learn to love as God loves, not because we are strong, but because we are weak and rely on his strength. His love is patient and kind, unshaken by circumstance, and unyielding in its pursuit of the good. As we endure trials, our love begins to take on these qualities, reflecting more and more of his divine nature. Suffering refines our love by drawing us closer to its source. It reminds us that all true love flows from God, and that we are called to be vessels of this love in the world. Through the fire of pain, we are purified not for our own sake, but so that we might love others with a heart that has been shaped by his grace. And in this we find that suffering is not a curse, but a gift, for it transforms our love into something eternal. Human love, as beautiful as it can be, is bound by limitations. It falters under the weight of imperfection, disappoints in moments of weakness, and sometimes leaves us when we need it most. But God's love is of a different kind. It does not waver with the seasons of life or diminish in the face of our failures. When all else fades, his love remains steadfast, the unshakable foundation upon which we can rest. In the wake of human betrayal or neglect, the love of God shines all the brighter. It meets us in our darkest moments, when the ache of disappointment threatens to overwhelm us. His love is not conditional upon the actions of others or even upon our own worthiness. It flows freely, abundantly, reaching into the depths of our pain to offer healing and hope. When human love fails, it can feel as though the world has crumbled beneath our feet. Yet even in this desolation, God's love holds firm. It is the one anchor that remains unbroken, the one light that refuses to be extinguished. His love does not merely fill the void left by others, it surpasses it, reminding us that no earthly love can compare to the eternal love of the Creator. God's love is not diminished by our own shortcomings or by the wounds others have inflicted upon us. He sees us in our brokenness and loves us still, with a love that is both tender and fierce. This love does not demand that we be whole before we approach Him. It meets us precisely where we are, in the midst of our pain, our doubt, and our fear. In moments when human love has disappointed us, we often question whether we are truly lovable. Yet God's love answers the question with a resounding yes. His love is not dependent on our performance or the approval of others. It is a love that simply is a love that existed before we were born and will continue long after all else has faded. The constancy of God's love is a source of profound comfort. While human love may fluctuate with circumstances, His love is eternal and unchanging. It is not swayed by our failures or the failings of others. In this constancy we find a refuge, a safe place where we are fully known and fully loved no matter what. Even when we feel most abandoned, God's love remains. It does not retreat in the face of our sorrow or distance itself from our struggles. Instead, it draws near, wrapping us in a peace that surpasses understanding. His love reminds us that we are never truly alone, even when human relationships fall short. God's love transcends the boundaries of human comprehension. It is not limited by time, circumstance, or capacity. While human love may falter under the weight of imperfection, His love remains perfect and infinite. It reminds us that our worth is not determined by the love or approval of others, but by the Creator who loved us first. The failures of human love often teach us to guard our hearts, to build walls that protect us from further hurt. But God's love invites us to tear down those walls, to trust in a love that will never fail us. It is not a love that eliminates pain, but one that carries us through it, transforming our wounds into places of grace. In the presence of God's unwavering love, we are reminded that disappointment in human relationships, while painful, is not the end of the story. His love fills the gaps left by others, offering a fullness and completeness that no human affection can achieve. In this we find the courage to keep loving, to keep hoping, and to rest in the assurance that His love will never leave us nor forsake us. Brokenness has a way of bringing life into sharp focus. When the relationships we cherish shatter, when trust is betrayed, or when love fades, we are confronted with the fragile, temporal nature of all things human. In these moments of pain, God whispers to us not to deny the sorrow, but to see beyond it. Brokenness is not the end of the story. It is an invitation to look upward, to find in Him a love and truth that are eternal. Fractured relationships remind us that nothing on earth is permanent. We invest so much of ourselves in human connections, hoping they will endure, yet they often fall short of our expectations. This painful reality, though bitter, can also be redemptive. It loosens our grip on the temporal and turns our gaze toward the eternal, where God's presence is unchanging and His love unfailing. In our brokenness, we are reminded of our need for something greater than what the world can offer. Human love, no matter how genuine, is always incomplete. It carries within it the seeds of its own limitations. But God's love transcends these boundaries. When relationships falter, He meets us with a love that is not subject to time or circumstance, calling us into deeper communion with Him. Brokenness is a moment of reckoning, a time when we are forced to confront the insufficiency of earthly things. Yet it is also a moment of grace, for it is often in our deepest pain that God's eternal truths become most evident. The cracks in our lives allow His light to shine through, illuminating His promise that He is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Pain in relationships often reveals the yearning within us for something unbreakable. We long for a connection that cannot be severed, a love that cannot fail. This yearning is not misplaced. It is the echo of eternity written on our hearts. God uses the fractures of life to draw us closer to Himself, reminding us that His love is the only love that truly satisfies. When relationships crumble, we may feel as though our world is falling apart. Yet God is not absent in our brokenness. He is present in a way that is profoundly intimate. He uses the pain to draw us into his eternal embrace, teaching us that while human relationships may falter, his presence is a refuge that cannot be shaken. The temporal nature of human relationships is not a flaw, but a reminder. It points us to the eternal, urging us to place our ultimate hope not in people, but in God. In his unchanging presence, we find a stability that no earthly connection can provide. This does not diminish the value of human love, but places it within the context of a greater, unending love. Through brokenness, God invites us to see life through the lens of eternity. The pain of fractured relationships can either embitter us or draw us closer to him. It is an opportunity to reorient our hearts, to let go of idols we may have made of human connections, and to cling to the one who will never leave us nor forsake us. God does not waste our pain. When relationships break, he uses the fragments to build something new, a deeper understanding of his love, a closer walk with him, and a heart more attuned to eternal realities. Our brokenness becomes the soil in which his grace takes root, growing in us a faith that is steadfast and a hope that endures. In the face of broken relationships, God's eternal presence offers solace and strength. He reminds us that while human connections are precious, they are not the source of our ultimate identity or worth. That source is found in him alone, in his unchanging love and his eternal promises. Brokenness, painful as it is, becomes a doorway, a sacred invitation to step into the eternal and find rest in his unshakable presence. Healing is not an instantaneous cure, it is a journey, one that begins in the deep places of our hurt and leads us toward wholeness. It is easy to think of healing as simply the alleviation of pain, but God's healing is far richer than that. His touch does not merely numb the wound, but restores it, weaving the broken parts of our hearts into something stronger and more beautiful than before. His healing is a journey from survival to renewal, from the weight of suffering to the freedom of restoration. When we are wounded, the pain is raw, immediate, and all-consuming, but God's healing hand works slowly, tenderly, over time. It is not a quick fix, but a deep, transformative process. As we allow him to work in us, we begin to see that his purpose is not just to end our suffering, but to make us whole, to shape us into people who reflect his glory, even in our scars. The path to healing is often winding, with moments of progress and moments of setback. It is not always easy, nor is it free from pain. Yet each step taken with God is a step toward renewal. In his presence, our wounds are not wasted, they are the very tools he uses to shape us. What once seemed like an insurmountable hurt becomes, in his hands, a wellspring of wisdom and compassion. Survival is often the first phase of healing. We endure, we cope, we make it through the day. But God's vision for us is greater than mere survival. He does not want us to simply get by, to live in a state of perpetual endurance. He invites us to something more, a restoration that brings us into a deeper understanding of his love and a richer experience of life. His healing leads us beyond the scars of the past to a renewed sense of purpose, wholeness, and peace. In the process of healing, the wound itself begins to change. It no longer defines us by its pain, but becomes a part of our story, a place where God's grace has touched and transformed us. What was once a source of brokenness becomes a mark of redemption, a testimony to the power of his love. The scars we carry are not reminders of what we have lost, but of what we have gained in him: wisdom, strength, and a capacity to love more deeply. Healing does not erase the past, but redeems it. Our wounds, once the source of our shame, become the vessels through which God's love flows to others. We find that our pain, far from being meaningless, has been used by God to cultivate a heart of compassion. In this way, our suffering is transformed into a gift we can offer to those who are still walking through their own darkness. God's healing does not simply fix what is broken, it transforms it. It leads us into a new identity, one that is not defined by our hurts, but by his love. Our scars are not signs of defeat, but of victory, the victory of grace over suffering, of hope over despair, of light over darkness. Through his touch, we are restored to the fullness of who we were always meant to be. Healing is a journey, and it is not one we walk alone. God is with us every step of the way, gently guiding us toward wholeness. Even in our most fragile moments, he holds us close, reminding us that his love is steadfast and his purpose for us is sure. He will not leave us where we are, but will continue to restore us, leading us toward a life of fullness and joy. The journey of healing is not one of perfect, linear progress. There will be valleys and mountains, moments of joy and moments of grief. But as we walk it with God, we can trust that he is working in us, reshaping us, and leading us toward something greater. His healing touch restores not only our bodies, but our souls, transforming us into people who carry his love and wisdom into the world. In the end, healing is not just about getting better, it is about becoming whole. It is about being restored to the person God created us to be, with a heart that reflects his love and a life that is marked by grace. This journey is long, but it is one that leads us toward a beauty and peace that can only be found in his presence. Through every step, God's healing is a reminder that even in our brokenness, we are never beyond his touch. In the end, we come to realize that the greatest wounds we bear are not the ones inflicted by the world, but those we receive from the ones we love. For in love, there is risk, a vulnerability that leaves us open to both the sweetest joys and the deepest sorrows. When those we cherish cause us pain, the temptation is to withdraw, to shield ourselves from the very thing that has the power to hurt us. Yet, in the quiet aftermath of such hurts, we discover that God's love does not retreat. It does not shrink from our brokenness, rather, it draws near, offering a touch of healing that only the Creator can give. The divine touch is not a magic wand that erases the pain, but a balm that soothes the soul. It does not promise that the wounds will vanish, but that they will be transformed. Our scars, once marks of our suffering, become symbols of grace, reminders that even in the darkest hours, we are held in the hands of a God who knows our pain and does not abandon us. His healing is not merely the end of suffering, but the beginning of a deeper, more intimate relationship with him. In the depths of hurt, we come to understand his love not as an abstract concept, but as a living, breathing reality that reaches into our very being. When human love fails, it is often because we are all, in our frailty, bound by the limits of our own hearts. We fail to love perfectly to meet the needs of others as we would wish. But in God there is no such failure. His love is constant, unwavering, and all-encompassing. It does not falter when human affection falls short. When the ones we love hurt us, it is not a reflection of God's love, but of the imperfect nature of human beings. And yet, in the wake of that hurt, it is God's love that sustains us, lifting us from the ashes of despair into the light of hope. The healing God offers is a healing that changes us. It does not merely mend our brokenness, but through it, God brings us closer to the person we were always meant to be. In our woundedness, we are given a deeper capacity for compassion, a greater understanding of his grace, and a more profound sense of his presence. Through the pain we endure, we are invited into the eternal, to taste something of the love that will never fail, to experience the peace that transcends all understanding. In this way, our suffering becomes a doorway, a passage, into a fuller experience of God's healing touch. Ultimately, when those we love hurt us, we are given the opportunity to witness a love that is both beyond us and within us. It is a love that does not ask us to understand or explain our pain, but to trust in the one who can heal it. God's love is not bound by the limits of time or circumstance. It is eternal, unchanging, and ever-present. When the ones we love hurt us, it is God who becomes our refuge, our comfort, and our healing touch. In his embrace, we find the strength to forgive, the courage to move forward, and the peace to rest. Through it all, we are reminded that love, in its truest form, is always redemptive.